Joining me now are John Heilemann from the debate location in Florida. He's the national affairs editor for New York Magazine and MSNBC political analyst. Tom Brokaw, NBC News special correspondent and author of The Time of Our Lives, a conversation about America, who we are, where we've been, and where we need to go now to recapture the American dream. And Chris Hayes, host of MSNBC's Up with Chris Hayes. Thank you all for joining me tonight. Tom, how do you score it?
Well, I always let the voters decide how they want to score it. I really just try to call balls and strikes here. You know, who scored the most runs tonight, we'll know on Tuesday when the Florida voters go to the polls. I do think objectively, however, that there was a different Mitt Romney on the stage tonight. I think in the last 10 days or so, the questions have been both can he throw a punch and can he take a punch? Well, tonight he threw a punch pretty effectively against Newt Gingrich at the very beginning. The speaker did not look happy on that stage. And I think one of the essential questions about his work for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac has never been asked. For all the explanations and all the accusations against him, what in fact did you do for $1.6 million? That's a simple question. I think that, on the other hand, Governor Romney still and will continue to have difficulty explaining the difference between what happened with health care in Massachusetts and the Obama plan.
You have an insight, I believe, into these candidates standing up there that none of the rest of us can have, since you've been at that moderator's desk so many times and get them at close range. I had this feeling tonight watching Gingrich and watching Romney. Romney prepares. He goes into debate prep sessions. He gets things. He memorizes things. He phrases them well. And Gingrich, I have the feeling there's not that much prep involved, that he's actually just kind of standing back in the batter's box, waiting for his pitch, looking for that John King pitch that he can just knock right out of the park. And if that pitch doesn't come, the magic doesn't happen.
Well, but Newt Gingrich has been doing this every day since he left the speaker's job, and every day before that, and when he ran for Congress. This is a man who has been on a constant loop of being a politician someplace in America, speaking on a wide variety of issues. So he's tuned up and ready to dance whenever the music starts. I don't think that's ever a problem for him.
Chris Hayes, when it came to that question about the investments in Freddie Mac, and by the way, this mutual fund that Mitt Romney talks about was called something like, I saw it written down here, the government fund, mutual fund. It's very, and half of it at least was Freddie Mac. You got the feeling that when Romney turned it to Newt and said, you know what's in your, that he didn't really know what was in his investment.
It was remarkable that that Gingrich would lead with that and not have already vetted, covered what the obvious response would be. And he didn't even have a response. He just sort of glowered at him and went along. And I thought generally Gingrich's performance was remarkably listless and ineffective. I thought he seemed cowed. He seemed not particularly energetic. I thought he really got his butt kicked all over the place, I thought, tonight. And I was surprised by that because he obviously had a lot to lose, first of all, because the polling does show Romney trending upwards and Newt sort of regressing to the mean of what his polling has been. And also because his best shot at the nomination, and I think probably his only shot, was to parlay the momentum off of South Carolina into a big win in Florida. And I thought it was almost like he just didn't show up tonight.
John Heilemann, Newt Gingrich has gotten most of his momentum out of debates. What did he get out of this debate tonight, and what did he need to get?
Well, Lawrence, I think that Chris Hayes is right. I think this was an incredibly important debate. I think both the debates this week are important for the reasons that Chris said. I think that Newt Gingrich needs to win Florida if he has to have is he going to have any chance to win the Republican nomination? And I think he's performed poorly in both of these debates. I think, to your point earlier, you have him exactly right. I think he came into this debate tonight and did not have a strategy, did not set out to accomplish anything in particular. He was extemporizing most of the time, and I think it hurt him terribly in the context of Romney, who was terribly not just well prepared, but had a real strategy, knew what he wanted to do, knew where he wanted to project strength. There was a point not only where Romney had that canned line where he came back at Gingrich on his finances, but where Wolf Blitzer offered, Gingrich a chance to kind of let the subject go, and Gingrich kind of backed down and said, well, I'm ready to call a truce on this. And Romney stepped right back up into it and said, no, I don't want to let this go. Let's litigate this issue some more. I think that was a very strong moment for him. And I think throughout, once Gingrich decided to back down on the issue of finances, and it was an issue where he was not well prepared, there is data out there, there's opposition research out there that suggests that Romney may not be telling the truth about whether some of these investments were in blind trusts, especially the ones on Fannie and Freddie. Gingrich didn't seem to know about that. I thought that once Gingrich backed down on that issue, he was deflated and pretty much out of the debate for the rest of the time. And the person who really took the fight to Mitt Romney for the rest of the debate was Rick Santorum, who had a very good debate performance, although he is so far behind here now and so broke, I don't think it will matter very much for him. So this is a big win, I think, for Mitt Romney and a big loss for Newt Gingrich.
I want to get to Santorum because I was surprised at how well he did tonight. He really became a factor in the debate, if not necessarily the final outcome in Florida. But I also want to talk about the day we saw that led up to this. And, Tom, it's unlike any day that I know of in Republican Party politics or Democratic Party politics where a party got together and said there's someone we have to stop in this race. And the attacks came on Newt Gingrich like we've never seen. Bob Dole, which is not surprising, a Romney endorser, putting out a letter saying Newt was a lot of trouble to try to work with in congressional leadership. A shocking piece by Elliot Abrams that I knew none of this history, that Elliot Abrams goes back to the point where Newt Gingrich had real differences with Ronald Reagan on foreign policy and quoted Newt Gingrich in a 1986 House floor statement saying this about President Reagan: measured against the scale and momentum of the Soviet Empire's challenge, the Reagan administration has failed, is failing, and without a dramatic change in strategy will continue to fail. President Reagan is clearly failing. And this is Newt Gingrich, who's been the Reagan Republican in the campaign so far.
He said something even more damning than that. When Ronald Reagan was going to meet with Mikhail Gorbachev, he actually compared it to Neville Chamberlain meeting with Hitler.
Yes, that's another quote that was released again today.
Right.
Yes.
And and I have actually looked at those diaries as well. I keep them on my bedside because it's such an insight into what Ronald Reagan was thinking when he was the president. And I looked again today, and Newt Gingrich is in there as a young congressman early in the and just kind of in passing. It doesn't mean that he didn't have solid conservative credentials when he was in the House or when he was the Speaker. But his association with Ronald Reagan, and he's even thrown in Margaret Thatcher on a couple of occasions, I think really does kind of stretch the relationships that they probably had.
And with Dole, he called Dole back in those days the tax collector of the welfare state. And I, working in the Senate occasionally with Bob Dole trying to reach compromises, he would mutter to us about Gingrich and these horrible stresses he's having.
Well, the thing about Newt Gingrich is he has something to say about something 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when you get into a campaign like that, that's going to catch up to you.
And well, that's why I want to go to how Gingrich defended his relationship to Ronald Reagan in this debate tonight where it came up. Let's go to Gingrich on Ronald Reagan.
It's increasingly interesting to watch the Romney attack machine coordinate things. And all of a sudden today, there are like 4 different articles by 4 different people that randomly show up. The fact is, I'm thrilled that Michael Reagan has endorsed me and will be campaigning with me here in Florida. I remember very fondly in 1995 when we were at the Goldwater Institute, and Nancy Reagan said, you know, Barry gave Ronnie the torch, and now Ronnie's passing the torch to Newt and his team in Congress. So I think it's reasonable to say, and I think the governor said it fairly, I am vastly closer to Reagan. But those of us who were in the trenches fighting in the 80s, it would be nice to be recognized for what we actually did and not to have orchestrated attacks that try to distort the history of that period.
Chris Hayes, what matters, do you think, to Florida voters in this discussion of that for some of them might feel like ancient history?
I think what matters is actually the subtext of all this, which is the signaling from the establishment. I think the actual content of who is closer to Reagan is actually less important. Voters make decisions based on the sources they trust, and the sources they trust can be everything from a cable news network to talk radio to other elected officials that they once admired. And what is happening in the subtext of this concerted effort by the Republican establishment is a kind of critical mass of people that have some reputational capital, leveraging it with the voters to say, stop, do not proceed, do not pass go. It will be a disaster. And the unanimity with which people have said that, I think, cannot but help have an impact on how voters. A similar thing happened with Howard Dean in 2004. It wasn't quite as unanimous, but there was a moment in which much of the establishment, this happened after Al Gore endorsed Dean, and all of a sudden people started to think, oh, this guy might actually get the nomination. There was a very concerted effort for people to come forward and say, do not do this. This is crazy. He's not electable, et cetera, et cetera. And what's happening with Newt is unlike anything I've ever seen, precisely because there's so much personal pique that has been built up and is now being let go. But I think that's really what it is. It is signaling from the establishment to the base, to the voters, saying, believe us, trust us. do not do this.
John Heilemann, in Florida, Newt Gingrich on the campaign trail today is clearly taking on the establishment. He's not trying to duck and pretend this isn't happening, and he's saying you, the Florida voters, have to rise up against them.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting, Lawrence, there's been some reporting, and I've seen it here a little bit myself, where there's a really clear divide between the kinds of crowds that are showing up for Romney events, the kinds of crowds that are showing up for Gingrich events. You're talking about a big class divide where you have a much more blue collar, much more Tea Party, much more populist crowd showing up for Gingrich events, and a much more upper crust wine track. When people used to divide voters into the wine track and the beer track, you got the beer track for Gingrich and very much the wine track and the cucumber sandwiches with the crust trimmed off kind of crowd showing up for Romney events. I think Gingrich is trying to lean into this, and it's the only thing he can do, is to try to say, do you guys really want to vote for the candidate who's the approved candidate, Bob Dole and John McCain? Is that the kind of Republican Party that is the new Republican Party? That's not the party that we are anymore, and he's trying to take that Tea Party mantle. His campaign is sending out a lot of press releases talking about the backing of the Tea Party, and the question ultimately on next Tuesday is going to be, what is the Republican Party of Florida?
Just lost John Heilemann. We're going to take a break here. John Heilemann will be back. Tom Brokaw will be back. Chris Hayes will be back. Stay with us. Coming up, more on tonight's debate with our panel, and joining me later, the Democratic Senate candidate from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren. We'll find out what she thinks about Mitt Romney, his taxes, and how that's playing in Massachusetts. That's coming up.